All right, in this lesson, we're going to be talking about hoisting. So what is hoisting? Well, JavaScript has this unique little feature that allows you to use variables before they're even declared. In many other programming languages, that is a big no-no, but in JavaScript, you can get away with declaring a variable later. It doesn't mean that you should. So if we just create a little div in our HTML called test, head over to our javascript.js, and we write variable A is equal to something, variable B, else. We can then say document.querySelector test.innerHTML is equal to A plus B. In fact, actually, let's add a space in there. A plus B. Save, refresh, and it shows up. Now that's nothing new to us. That's because we declared a variable here, and then we assigned it a value. But what happens if we get rid of that and declare the variable here? Variable A, variable B. I hit refresh, and it still loads. Now, what we're observing here is called hoisting. And in JavaScript, that means your variable, whenever it's declared, is going to go to the top of its scope. Again, there's that word that we're not quite familiar with. Scope. What is that? We're going to get into that very shortly. It's coming, I promise you. Now, what happens if we do this? Save this. It says something undefined. Now, why is a variable B undefined? Well, that's because the query selector is trying to use variable A, something, and variable B. Now, it's not that B doesn't exist. It's just that it doesn't exist yet. So it was declared because it was at the bottom here. Variable B, JavaScript sees this as this. So while B has been declared, it doesn't have a value yet, and thus it's undefined. Whereas if we gave it a different variable that does not exist, C, and refresh the page, we actually get, open up our console, C is not defined. We get a legitimate error. So I go ahead and I undo that, and I move this back up, and everything works. So essentially, what JavaScript will do is, anytime you see var, it's going to move to the top. Now let's wrap this in a function. Change text. So now we're wrapping this in a function. It's going to work the same way. It's going to work perfectly, as expected. But what if we moved var A and B, again, below the query selector? Well, it still shows up perfectly fine. Now, the reason for that is because var, again, moves to the top. Okay, so I've really beaten down this concept of moving to the top. I'm doing air quotes again. But what you don't know is that var A and B does not break out of its function. Its scope is the curly brackets. So var A and B will only move up here, which means var A and B outside of this function is not accessible. Now that goes with anonymous functions, it goes with self-invoking functions, regular functions, it goes with any sort of scope in JavaScript. And again, we're getting to scope, I promise we're going to get there, but for the time being, it's good to know that when you declare a variable, it's not the same thing as assigning a value. To declare a variable simply means to create the variable name. It's like registering it. It doesn't mean that there's any value associated with it yet. It just means that it simply exists, but you don't know what's inside of it until you assign it something. And that could be a string, integer, float, undefined, null, whatever, you name it. So that's the concept behind hoisting. Now, when you're writing other languages like Python, PHP, hoisting is not very common, but as a JavaScript developer, it's good to know that hoisting will do this. Now, there's a best practice here. Whenever you're declaring a variable, declare it at the top of the scope, even if you're not using it yet. So if you have a bunch of code in here, whatever that might be, even if variable A and B do not have any sort of assignment to them, they don't have any values, declare them anyways. Now, there's two reasons for that. Hoisting can sometimes lead to bugs. A lot of developers aren't aware that hoisting is a thing. And two, it tells other developers that, hey, in this scope, we are using these variables. They might not have values yet, but we are using them. And so that just gives other developers a heads up so that they know what's going on a little bit sooner. So they don't have to read, 20, 50, or 200 lines of code and then all of a sudden think to themselves, hey, where the heck is that variable? Like, why is it here and why is it not declared somewhere else? When they get into this function, they know exactly what they're getting into. So that's your quick introductory lesson into what hoisting is. There's no homework. There's no assignment with this. Again, this is just one of those concepts that I want you to put in your back pocket for now. It's very useful when we start learning about scope and how scope actually works and what it does, and when we start talking about closures and whatnot. But if there are two things to take away from this, it's one, declaring a variable is not the same thing as assigning a variable, and the declaration of a variable always moves to the top of its scope. And two is that you want to declare your variables at the top of the scope or as early as possible. Even if you're not assigning it a value, just declare it.